My name is Bridget Sawyer, and I am 29 years old, 6 hours before my wedding ceremony. My mother-in-law called our photographer directly, using a fabricated story about a double booking, and convinced him to cancel, leaving us with no one to document the single day we had spent 14 months planning. I did not find out until 40 minutes before the ceremony, standing in my dress, when the venue coordinator asked casually where the photographer's team had set up. My best friend Hannah, who had flown in the night before with nothing but an overnight bag and her own camera, the one she had been using professionally for 6 years before switching careers, looked at me, looked at the empty space where equipment should have been, and said, "Give me 10 minutes. Those photographs hang on our living room wall." Today, 3 years later, taken by someone who was never supposed to be the one capturing that day. Before I tell you what happened after the ceremony, please take a moment to like and subscribe. Drop your city and the time where you are watching from. I read every single comment. Let me take you back to the year I met Connor, and the mother who decided, almost immediately, that I was not what she had planned for her son. I met Connor Whitley during my final year of pharmacy school, at a mutual friend's barbecue, a relationship that began easily and felt, for most of our 2 years of dating, genuinely uncomplicated. Connor's mother, Eleanor, was a different matter. Almost from the very first introduction, Eleanor had been, by every account I gathered over the following years, deeply involved in curating Connor's life choices since childhood, an involvement that had apparently included strong opinions about previous girlfriends, about his career path, about essentially every significant decision he had made as an adult. I learned, fairly early in our relationship, that Eleanor had specifically favored a previous girlfriend of Connor's, a woman named Patrice, who had grown up in the same country club social circle Eleanor herself belonged to, a relationship that had ended roughly a year before Connor and I met, for reasons Connor described only vaguely as, quote, not being the right fit. Despite everyone's hopes, I did not fully understand, during our early dating period, how directly that comment about everyone's hopes would eventually apply to me as well. Eleanor's behavior toward me, from our very first meeting, contained a particular quality I struggled to name precisely for a long time. She was never overtly hostile. She was, instead, persistently, carefully underwhelming in her enthusiasm. The kind of polite distance that requires considerable energy to maintain consistently across years. She would ask about my career with a tone that suggested genuine interest while somehow making pharmacy sound, through subtle phrasing, choices less impressive than whatever profession Patrice had apparently pursued. She would mention, periodically, family friends' children who had married, quote, wonderfully suitable partners, comparisons that never directly named me, but that landed, consistently, exactly where she intended them to land. Connor, for his part, acknowledged his mother could be, quote, particular, but generally avoided any sustained confrontation with her about specific comments. A pattern that, looking back, probably should have concerned me considerably more than it did at the time. Connor proposed, after 2 years together, a private moment at the same restaurant where we had eaten our first date, considerably more romantic in execution than I had genuinely expected him capable of planning. I called my own parents first, the way you do when something wonderful happens and you want to share it immediately with people you trust will simply be happy. Connor called his mother separately, later that same evening. He told me afterward that Eleanor's reaction had included considerable enthusiasm about the engagement itself, though she had almost immediately begun asking detailed questions about wedding planning specifics, questions that, in retrospect, represented the opening movements of what would become a pattern of increasing involvement and increasing control over decisions that, by any reasonable standard, belonged primarily to Connor and me. The wedding planning process, spanning roughly 14 months, became, gradually, a sustained negotiation between what Connor and I actually wanted and what Eleanor believed the wedding should represent, given what she described, repeatedly, as the family's social standing and the expectations that came with it. I want to be specific about several incidents during this planning period, because I think the accumulated pattern matters considerably to understanding how the wedding day itself eventually unfolded. Eleanor insisted, early in the planning process, on selecting the venue herself, a country club, considerably more formal and considerably more expensive than what Connor and I had originally budgeted for. ultimately agreeing only because she offered to cover the difference in cost, an offer that, looking back, came with considerably more strings attached than either of us fully anticipated at the time. She suggested, repeatedly, an alternative guest list that would have included numerous family friends Connor and I barely knew, while subtly questioning the inclusion of several guests from my own side, including at one particularly tense planning dinner, a direct suggestion that perhaps Hannah, my closest friend since college, did not need to be included in the wedding party itself, a suggestion Connor, to his credit, firmly rejected. The photographer selection process became, in retrospect, an early indication of exactly how far Eleanor was willing to go to control elements of the wedding she had not been given direct authority over. Connor and I had selected a photographer named Marcus Yee, a young, talented professional whose distinctive, documentary-style approach to wedding photography we had both genuinely loved. After reviewing his portfolio extensively, we booked him roughly 10 months before the wedding, paying a substantial deposit that represented, for our combined budget, a significant financial commitment. Eleanor, upon learning of our selection, suggested, repeatedly, an alternative photographer she described as, quote, more established, a photographer who, I learned later, happened to be the same person who had photographed several weddings within Eleanor's social circle, including, notably, the wedding of the same family friend's daughter, whose marriage Eleanor had previously cited as exemplifying, quote, wonderfully suitable partnerships. We declined Eleanor's suggestion, maintaining our booking with Marcus. I did not fully appreciate, at the time, how significantly that specific disagreement would eventually matter. The wedding day arrived on a Saturday in June, 14 months after Connor's proposal. At the country club venue Eleanor had ultimately helped select and substantially fund, I spent the morning in a bridal suite with Hannah, my mother, and 2 other close friends. The typical chaos of hair, makeup, and final preparations that precedes most wedding ceremonies. Genuinely happy despite the underlying tension that had characterized much of the preceding 14 months of planning. Hannah had arrived the previous evening from out of state, mentioning, somewhat in passing during the rehearsal dinner, that she had brought her old camera equipment along, the one she had used professionally for 6 years before transitioning into a corporate marketing career roughly 2 years earlier, simply because, she said, she liked having it available for casual photos throughout the weekend, regardless of the actual wedding photography being separately handled. I did not think much of this comment at the time. I had no reason to anticipate how significant that casual decision would eventually become. The venue coordinator approached me roughly 40 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to begin, asking, with a slightly confused expression, where Marcus and his assistant had set up their equipment. Since the designated photography staging area remained entirely empty, I told her I was uncertain, that Marcus had confirmed his arrival time just 2 days earlier via email, and asked her to check directly with the venue's event manager about whether he had perhaps arrived, and was simply working from a different location. The event manager returned several minutes later with information that produced a kind of cold, disorienting shock I genuinely had not anticipated. Needing to process 40 minutes before walking down the aisle, Marcus had called the venue directly that morning, canceling his services, citing a scheduling conflict that had supposedly arisen due to a double booking error on his end. I called Marcus immediately. He did not answer. I texted him, asking directly what had happened. Given that we had confirmed his attendance just 2 days earlier with no indication whatsoever of any scheduling conflict, Marcus responded roughly 15 minutes later, his message considerably more revealing than I had anticipated. He apologized, explaining that he had received a call early that morning from a woman identifying herself as the mother of the groom, explaining that there had been a significant miscommunication regarding the booking, that another photographer had actually been contracted for that specific date and venue, and that continuing to show up would create a, quote, considerably awkward situation he should avoid entirely. Marcus told me he had, understandably, assumed this represented some kind of family-side confusion about contracts and bookings, and had decided, in the interest of avoiding what sounded like a genuinely uncomfortable conflict, to simply step back from the engagement entirely, refunding our deposit as a gesture of goodwill given the circumstances. I understood immediately, reading this message, exactly what had actually occurred. Eleanor had fabricated an entirely fictional scheduling conflict, specifically timed to occur close enough to the ceremony that finding a replacement photographer would be genuinely impossible, while distant enough from the actual ceremony start time that I would have just enough warning to feel the full weight of the crisis without any realistic opportunity to resolve it. I confronted Eleanor directly, finding her in the venue's lobby roughly 20 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to begin, my wedding dress still on. My voice considerably less composed than I would have preferred for what should have been one of the calmest mornings of my entire life. I asked her directly whether she had called Marcus that morning regarding a supposed booking conflict. Eleanor's expression shifted through several stages. Initial denial transitioning, fairly quickly given the directness of my question and the limited time available for prolonged deflection, into a considerably more defensive justification. She said she had simply believed, quote, more strongly, that her own photographer recommendation represented a superior choice for documenting such an important family event, and that she had, perhaps, overstepped slightly in attempting to, quote, correct what she viewed as a planning oversight. I told her, as evenly as I could manage, given the circumstances, that her actions had left us, less than 20 minutes before our ceremony, with no photographer whatsoever, and asked her directly what she actually expected us to do about that fact at this specific moment. She did not have a particularly satisfying answer to that question. I returned to the bridal suite, considerably more shaken than I wanted to be, walking into my own ceremony, and explained briefly what had actually happened to Hannah and my mother. Hannah, who had been quietly listening while finishing her own hair preparation, set down her hairbrush, walked to her overnight bag, and retrieved the camera equipment she had mentioned bringing along almost as an afterthought the previous evening. She told me, with a calm, steady confidence I genuinely needed in that exact moment, that she had spent 6 years photographing weddings professionally before her career shift, that she had not lost any of those skills simply because she had stopped doing it for pay, and that she would be documenting my wedding herself properly, with the same care she would have brought to any client she had ever worked with during her professional years. She asked for 10 minutes to adjust her equipment and review the venue's lighting conditions. Then she told me simply to go get married, and to trust that the day would be documented exactly as it deserved to be. The ceremony itself proceeded, despite the chaos of the preceding hour, with a kind of genuine, unguarded emotion that I think, looking back, might have actually been enhanced rather than diminished by the crisis we had just navigated together as a family unit. Hannah moved throughout the ceremony and reception with practiced, unobtrusive skill, capturing moments with the kind of intuitive timing that comes from genuine experience rather than simply technical competence. The quiet tears during our vows, the genuine, unguarded laughter during the reception toasts, the specific way Connor looked at me during our first dance. I learned, considerably later that evening, that Connor had confronted his mother directly, away from the reception itself, expressing, in terms I understand, were considerably more direct than his typical pattern of avoiding sustained conflict with her, exactly how unacceptable her actions that morning had actually been. Eleanor attended the remainder of the reception with a notably subdued presence, considerably different from the confident, controlling energy she had brought to most of the preceding 14 months of planning. Hannah delivered the complete set of photographs roughly 3 weeks after the wedding, several hundred images, that, when Connor and I reviewed them together for the first time, genuinely surprised us with their quality and their emotional authenticity. We selected several images for prints, eventually framing a particular photograph from our first dance. The lighting genuinely beautiful, despite Hannah having worked with whatever ambient venue lighting happened to be available rather than the carefully arranged professional setup Marcus would have brought. That photograph has hung in our living room for 3 years now, a permanent, visible record of a day that could have been left entirely undocumented by someone's deliberate sabotage, salvaged instead by a friend's quiet competence and her willingness to step into a crisis without hesitation. Eleanor's relationship with Connor and me has remained, in the 3 years since the wedding, considerably more cautious and considerably more distant than it likely would have been without that specific incident. Connor has maintained, since that day, a considerably firmer boundary regarding his mother's involvement in decisions that belong, by any reasonable standard, to our own marriage and our own family, a shift that, while it took an extreme incident to fully solidify, has genuinely improved the overall dynamic of our relationship with her going forward. Eleanor has never offered a direct, explicit apology for what she did that morning, though she has, notably, never again attempted any similarly direct interference in decisions Connor and I have made together since. I think often about how close that morning came to leaving us with no documentation whatsoever of a day we had spent 14 months planning, simply because one person's need to control outcomes she had not been given authority over led her to sabotage something that mattered enormously to two people who had given her every reasonable opportunity to be genuinely included in the planning process. I think, too, about how genuinely fortunate we were that Hannah happened to bring equipment along, almost as an afterthought, transforming what could have been a permanent, painful gap in our wedding memories into something that, 3 years later, represents one of the things I am most genuinely grateful for regarding that entire day. The photographs on our wall do not show any indication of the crisis that preceded them. They show, simply, two people who loved each other, documented by someone who stepped forward exactly when she was needed most. That is my story. If you have ever had someone try to sabotage something important to you, only to have it salvaged by someone you least expected to step forward, I want to hear about it. Drop it in the comments. And if this story reminded you that the people who truly show up for you often reveal themselves most clearly during the moments that go wrong rather than the moments that go right, share it with someone who needs to hear that today. I will see you in the next one.